You're watching Capitol Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. We now turn to our Reporters Roundtable to continue our discussion about the upcoming lame duck session. And joining us this week, it's Brendan Moore with Lee Enterprises and Jerry Nowicki with Capital News Illinois. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Brendan, we'll start with you. Lame duck session, super exciting schedule ahead here. What are you most looking out for in these few days they're going to be going before the new General Assembly takes over?
Right. Well, as you know, Cole, lame duck session is a time where things can maybe sneak through at the very end when you have the old legislators. A lot of them don't have to face voters anymore. This was a few years ago when the Safety Act passed in the middle of the night. So, in theory, you could see something big move. One thing that's been talked about a little bit is the need for maybe some more pension reform because there's some concerns about whether the state's pensions meet safe harbor for Social Security. So that could be one thing. I don't think it's likely, but it's just an example of something that could happen. We're not hearing much from state legislators. I don't even think we have a schedule out yet as to what they might do, what legislation they might take up. There was some talk earlier a few months ago after President-elect Trump won about efforts to Trump-proof the state. Obviously, Illinois is a Democratic state. Our governor is a very vocal critic of the president-elect. That might not bode well for Illinois in terms of federal funding, in terms of other ways Illinois might be targeted. But just the folks I've talked to seem to say it's kind of a wait-and-see approach because nobody really knows what the president-elect or the administration in Washington is going to do yet. So it's very much we're in a holding pattern. They're going to do some stuff, but whether it's going to be earth-shattering, as we've maybe seen some of these lame duck sessions in the past, I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, Jerry, that's been kind of what we've been hearing for a long time now. I mean, last spring, they didn't really leave a ton left on the table to act on. There was even questions of whether veto would even happen or not, whether they would come back. They didn't really do anything in veto session. There's still some legislation they could act on, but I think a lot of the fervor that came post-election of we have to get back in the building, we have to start working, kind of fizzled out, I guess, in certain ways, and a lot of ideas didn't really actually grow out of that sort of reaction from lawmakers.
Right, and I think one of the interesting things with this lame duck especially is there aren't too many lame ducks in that there's not much turnover. The margins are going to remain the same in the upcoming session as they have been in recent years. So what we're looking at is bills aren't going to be significantly harder on January 8th after the new inauguration than they were on January 7th. So there's not real rushes to get anything done, but there is some bills that have already cleared one chamber that may just need approval from the other that could go. It's some of the, may have discussed it on here, the Kinship and Demand Act, which just generally allows family to be foster parents and get some of the same benefits from the state. That are an easier path to benefits that foster parents receive. So it's just stuff like that. There's a bill regulating hemp-derived THC, which the governor's backed, that we could see come to fruition here. But as for the Trump-proofing, it's sort of like they haven't telegraphed what that would be, and quite frankly, they've done a lot of it in the first Trump term that I think you can't rehash, but I'm sure they'll come up with something, and we'll get the details right ahead of when they come out. But as of yet, they've kept it pretty tightly as to what we may or may not see. Maybe it's just not much.
Yeah, Jerry, you mentioned that Delta 8 bill. Governor Pritzker making a big deal of endorsing the plan that made it through the Senate last spring and stalled in the House. I guess that sort of teased that up maybe as their action they can take to just kind of close that one out real quick here. That bill is interesting. It doesn't have unanimous support. Obviously, it stalled for a reason in the House. Would put some pretty strict regulations on these THC products that don't fall under the same regulations as marijuana and are actually federally legal. That one is an interesting bill to watch to see how things play out. I had Representative LaShawn Ford just recently told me he sees it as a way to potentially dig out of the financial hole a little bit, and they should tax those products more. So those are still some of the conversations that are happening on maybe some of the bills that looked at least teed up to finish in this lame duck session. Brendan, this whole slow-moving General Assembly going into the new year, Jerry said it's basically the same thing. There's no change in the numbers for the majorities. There's hardly any changes in some of the members that they're facing. Is this just an early start to the spring session? Get everybody here so they're here a little bit earlier going into the inauguration days and they can get conversations going earlier?
Yeah, I think that's it, and we saw that a little bit in veto session as well in November. They didn't really take a lot of legislative action, but sometimes it just helps to get them in the same room. They could start those conversations. Talked about maybe there being an energy bill to deal with some of the issues getting renewable energy online here in Illinois. There's talk about maybe doing a skinny bill in the lame duck, which would address some nearer term things, but also it would maybe tee up some conversations for later in the spring about a bigger bill. So there could certainly be some of that. And as Jerry said, I mean, there are some bills that are maybe kind of teed up where the Senate took action and the House just needs to approve, or vice versa. The Delta 8 bill is a great example of that. Passed, I think, 54-1 in the Senate. I mean, it was very bipartisan bill there, and it just seems like that's a House versus Senate issue, and we'll see if it gets resolved by Wednesday when they swear in the new General Assembly. But as you said, I mean, the margins are going to stay the same in both chambers. The Democrats, I mean, besides some votes on the budget last year, didn't really have a lot of issues passing their big bills. I wouldn't anticipate that for a lot of their issues this year until we get to some of the financial issues, which, as we've discussed on this show, are going to be quite steep come spring.
That's a great segue. Great segue. Let's go into I want to tie that, though, the financial pressures to that idea, the pension reform bill that you kind of brought up. This is the Tier 2 pension that they want, that we've seen labor unions, a whole labor coalition come together back in veto session and say they want huge Tier 2 pension reform. So to almost pull it pretty much even with what Tier 1 is now, Governor Pritzker has in no way endorsed that plan and has just talked about meeting that Social Security threshold that is needed to be federally compliant. And it would be interesting to see if they let that kind of fester, or if they get in, fix that Social Security issue real quick so they can kind of ignore the rest of the Tier 2 pension talk going into what is going to be a very, very difficult financial year for the state.
Yeah, it seems to me that the pension changes would also be accompanied by some level of what the governor has proposed in terms of extending the ramp for paying it down and increasing the goal to have it 100% funded as opposed to 90% funded in current law. So there are probably ways you could massage that to increase benefits while also not greatly changing the state's annual pension payment under law. I think any way you do it, you're probably adding some level of payment to that pension payment, but there are ways to mitigate it to some extent. But in terms of the broader picture as a whole, I think there's just, the budget is kind of the story for the upcoming legislative session, because $3.2 billion deficit is unlike anything the Pritzker administration. I mean, I guess you could count the COVID years in there that really threw things off, but ended up being in better shape because of some of the federal stimulus. But anyway, it's kind of unlike anything the Pritzker administration has seen coming into a session year. So essentially new programs are going to be off the table, and you're going to be looking at probably some need for new revenues or some need for spending cuts.
And where those spending cuts happen is obviously going to be a big deal as well. There's going to be a lot of pressure on some of the, I guess, more progressive programs that maybe have passed over the past 5 years under Pritzker. There was the the Republicans are already taking aim at the programs that are that were created for non-citizens in the state. The health care plan in particular has been the prime target going back years now. So those kinds of conversations are going to persist. And yeah, Jerry, it'll be. I'm wondering if that whole that pension ramp extension and this tier 2 adjustment for the Social Security stuff, if that doesn't end up being maybe a feature of the big budget address. We know last year Pritzker made that a big point in his speech of how he was not only going to continue paying down the pension stuff, but he had this new approach for kind of extending the ramp out, but making sure the benefits are still there. So I'm wondering if that's also kind of saved for that February window where he kind of gets to make his big pitch for what he wants the year to look like. That could be kind of where we see that pension can get kicked down the road too if it doesn't get acted on in the next week.
Yeah, I mean, I think the governor has used his budget address to make similar proposals. He made that pension proposal to extend the ramp and get it to 100%. I think it was last year, maybe a year before. They all blend together, but but with the pension tier 2 pensions, I think what you're going to see is the governor is going to the administration is going to push for something that's kind of a bare minimum that they have to meet safe harbor, because they are very cognizant of what Wall Street thinks about the state's finances, and anything that could put in jeopardy the state's credit rating, which has been upgraded quite a bit the past few years. But obviously, state has some financial issues ahead. They're going to be very cognizant of that. This is a governor who has his eyes on the future. He maybe has a re-election in 2026. We'll see, and maybe another campaign after that for a bigger house. And he's made the state turning around the state's fiscal ship a big part of that. So I think that he is going to be Governor No this year. I've seen that term thrown around a little bit, of saying, as Jerry said, no to new spending on new programs, and there's really going to have to be a look for some new revenues, perhaps. We haven't even talked about the need for the transit agencies need a lot of money. The CTA and Metra and PACE up in Chicago need, I believe, $750 million. That's the cliff that they're facing. And so how are they going to figure that out? Probably going to need some type of revenue enhancement for that. So it's going to be a very tough budget picture this year, and we're going to have to see how the governor puts it together in his address in February.
Yeah, you said there's perhaps going to be the need for new revenues. Those are gonna have to come at some point. When you look at these projections that the governor's own budget team has put out, you have like the deficit for this coming year that is well documented, but that just continues to grow. And I know those numbers change when you address the initial part of it and everything, but you can only play governor no for so long and shortening it. And if you make cuts, those groups are going to come right back to the table the next year and continue to call for that money to come back. So it'll be interesting. They've been able to find these clever little ways to raise revenue, which may not have been a widespread hit for much of the public. Last year it was sports betting, and they found the retail exemption. They finally got retailers to cave on that to claw some of that sales tax revenue back. And yeah, it'll just be interesting. I'm always fascinated. That's the big thing that I'm always looking for in that February speech is like, okay, what kind of clever way did they come up with to try to bring in some more revenue that isn't a income tax increase or something along those lines that everybody in the state is going to feel and remember during an election. So Jerry, I don't know if you have any opinions on that, or just if maybe they hold tight with the governor no now and maybe look to down the road for some of those more fiscal changes, or if this is something that they act on quickly and just bite the bullet.
So the $3.2 billion does seem structural in that it's going to continue year after year without action that continues year after year. So, one of the things I've heard mentioned, certainly not by the governor's office yet, it's not anything proposed, but is there an appetite to add a tax on services? Illinois sales tax only applies to goods. It doesn't necessarily apply to things like Netflix streaming or labor or other types of services like that. So I mean, that's in the fiscal reports you read just from straight budget people who aren't advocating either way. They say that's the clear path for making up large deficits if it's needed. So I mean, that's one thing to watch for. Again, I'm not saying that's been proposed or anyone's filing a bill with that language in it right now, but it is something I'm going to watch for.
Got it. Well, Brendan, Jerry, thank you both so much for joining us. Looking forward to covering a new General Assembly with you guys. We'll be right back.